Make an offering of 10%, a tithe, of all the produce which grows in your fields year after year. Bring this into the presence of God, your God, at the place He designates for worship. And there, eat the tithe from your grain, wine, and oil, and the firstborn fruit from your herds and flocks. In this way, you will learn to live in deep reverence before God, your God, as long as you live. But if the place God, your God, designates for worship is too far away and you cannot carry your tithe that far, God, your God, will still bless you. Exchange your tithe for money and take the money to the place God, your God, has chosen to be worshipped. Use the money to buy anything you want: cattle, sheep, wine, or beer, anything that looks good to you. You and your family cast then you and your family can then feast in the presence of God, your God, and have a good time. Meanwhile, don't forget to take good care of the Levites who live in your towns. They won't get any property or inheritance of their own, as you will. At the end of every third year, gather the tithe from all your produce of that year and put it aside in storage. Keep it in reserve for the Levite who won't get any property or inheritance, as you will, and for the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow who live in your neighborhood. That way, you'll have plenty to eat, and God, your God, will bless you in all your work. At the end of every seventh year, cancel all debts. This is the procedure. Everyone who has lent money to a neighbor writes it off. You must not press your neighbor or his brother for payment. All debts are canceled. God says so. You may collect payment from foreigners, but whatever you have lent to your fellow Israelite, you must write off. There must be no poor people among you, because God is going to bless you lavishly in this land that God, your God, is giving you as an inheritance, your very own land. But only if you listen obediently to the voice of God, your God, diligently observing every commandment that I command you today. Oh, yes, God, your God, will bless you just as He promised. You will lend to many nations, but won't borrow from any. You will rule over many nations, but none will rule over you. When you happen on someone who's in trouble or needs help among your people with whom you live in this land that God, your God, is giving you, don't look the other way, pretending you don't see Him. Don't keep a tight grip on your purse. No, let at no. Look at Him. Open your purse. Lend whatever and as much as He needs. Don't count the cost. Don't listen to that selfish voice saying, it's almost the seventh year. The year of all debts are canceled. And turn aside and leave your needy neighbor in the lurch, refusing to help him. He'll call God's attention to you and your blatant sin. Give freely and spontaneously. Don't have a stink. Give freely and spontaneously. Don't have a stingy heart. The way you handle matters like this triggers God, your God's blessings in everything you do. All your work and ventures. There are always good. There are always going to be poor and needy people among you. So I command you, always be generous, open purse and hands. Give to your neighbors in trouble, your poor and hurting neighbors. If a Hebrew man or Hebrew woman was sold to you and has served you for 6 years, in the seventh year you must set him or her free, released into a free life. And when you set them free, don't send them off empty-handed. Provide them with some animals, plenty of bread and wine and oil. Load them with provisions from all the blessings with which God, your God, has blessed you. Don't for a minute forget that you were once slaves in Egypt, and God, your God, redeemed you from that slave world. For that reason, this day I command you to do this. But if your slave, because he loves you and your family and has a good life with you, says, I don't want to leave you, then take an awl and pierce through his earlobe into the doorpost, marking him as your slave forever. Do the same with your woman slaves who want to stay with you. Don't consider this an unreasonable hardship, this setting your slave free. After all, he's worked 6 years for you, at half the cost of a hired hand. Believe me, God, your God, will bless you in everything you do. Set apart to God, your God, all the firstborn males in your herds and flocks. Don't use the firstborn from your herds as work animals. Don't shear the firstborn from your flocks. These are for you to eat each These are for you to eat every year, you and your family, in the presence of God, your God, at the place that God designates for worship. If the animal is defective, lame, say, or blind, anything wrong with it, don't slaughter it as a sacrifice to God, your God. Stay at home and eat it there. Both the ritually clean and unclean may eat it, the same as with a gazelle or a deer. Only you must not eat its blood. Pour the blood out on the ground like water. Observe the month of Abib by celebrating the Passover to God, your God. It was in this, it was in the month of Abib that God, your God, delivered you by night from Egypt. Offer the Passover sacrifice to God, your God, at the place God chooses to be worshipped by establishing his name there. Don't eat yeast bread with it. For 7 days, eat it with unraised bread. Hard times, bread, hard times, bread, because you left Egypt in a hurry. That bread will keep the memory fresh of how you left Egypt for as long as you live. There is there is to be no sign of yeast anywhere for 7 days. And don't let any of the meat that you sacrifice in the evening be left over until morning. Don't sacrifice the Passover in any of the towns that God, your God, gives you other than the one God, your God, designates for worship. There and there only you will offer the Passover sacrifice at evening as the sun goes down, marking the time that you left Egypt. Boil and eat it at the place designated by God, your God. Then at daybreak, turn around and go home. Eat unraised bread for 6 days. Set aside the seventh day as a holy Eat unraised bread for 6 days. Set aside the seventh day as a holiday. Don't do any work. Starting from the day you put the sickle to the ripe grain, count out 7 weeks. Celebrate the Feast of Weeks to God, your God, by bringing your free will offering. Give as generously as God, your God, has blessed you. Rejoice in the presence of God, your God. You, your son, your daughter, your servant, your maid, the Levite who lives in your neighborhood, the foreigner, the orphan, and widow among you. Rejoice at the place God, your God, will set aside to be worshipped. Don't forget that you were once a slave in Egypt. So be diligent in observing these regulations. Observe the Feast of Booths For 7 days, when you gather the harvest from your threshing floor and your wine vat, rejoice at your festival, you, your son, your daughter, your servant, your maid, the Levite, the foreigner, and the orphans and widows who live in your neighborhood. Celebrate the feast to God, your God, for 7 days at the place God designates. God, your God, has been blessing you in your harvest and in all your work. So make a day of it. Really celebrate. All your men must appear before God, your God, 3 times each year at the place he designates. At the feast of unraised bread, Passover, at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of booths. No one is to show up in the presence of God empty handed. Each man must bring as much as he can manage, giving generously in response to the blessings of God your God. Appoint judges and officers, organized by tribes, in all the towns that God your God is giving you. They are to judge the people fairly and honestly. Don't twist the law, don't play favorites, don't take a bribe. A bribe blinds even a wise person. It undermines the intentions of the best of people. The right, the right. Pursue only what's right. It's the only way you can really live and possess the land that God your God is giving you. Don't plant fertility Asherah trees alongside the altar of God. Your God. Don't plant fertility Asherah trees alongside the altar of God your God that you build. Don't set up phallic sex pillars. God your God hates them. And don't sacrifice to God your God an ox or sheep that is defective or has anything at all wrong with it. That's an abomination, an insult to God your God. If you find anyone within the towns that God your God is giving you doing what is wrong in God's eyes, breaking his covenant by going off to worship other gods, bowing down to them, the sun, say, or the moon, or any rebel sky gods, look at the evidence and investigate carefully. If you find that it is true, that in fact an abomination has been committed in Israel, then you are to take the man or woman who did this evil thing outside your city gates and stone the man or the woman. Hurl stones at the person until dead, but only on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses may a person be put to death. No one may be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. The witnesses must throw the first stones in the execution. Then the rest of the community joins in. You have to purge the evil from your community. When matters of justice come up that are too much for you, hard cases regarding homicides, legal disputes, fights, take them up to the central place of worship that God your God has designated. Bring them to the Levitical priests and the judge who is in office at the time. Consult them, and they will hand down the decision for you. Then carry out their verdict at the place designated by God, your God. Do what they tell you, in exactly the way they tell you. Follow their instructions precisely. Don't leave out anything. Don't add anything. Anyone who presumes to override or twist the decision handed down by the priest or judge who was acting in the presence of God, your God, is as good as dead. Root him out. Rid Israel of the evil. Everyone will take notice and be impressed. That will put an end to presumptuous behavior. When you enter the land that God, your God, is giving you and take it over and settle down, and then say, I'm going to get me a king like all the nations around me. Make sure you get yourself a king whom God, your God, chooses. Choose your king from among your kinsmen. Don't take a foreigner, only a kinsman. And make sure he doesn't build up a war machine, amassing military horses and chariots. He must not send people to Egypt to get more horses, because God told you you'll never go back there again. And make sure he doesn't build up a harem, collecting wives who will divert him from the straight and narrow. And make sure he doesn't pile up a lot of silver and gold. This is what must be done. When he sits down on the throne of his kingdom, the first king, he must do the first king. This is what must be done. When he sits down on the throne of his kingdom, the first thing he must do is make himself a copy of this revelation on a scroll, copied under the supervision of the Levitical priests. That scroll is to remain at his side at all times. He is to study it every day so that he may learn what it means to fear his God, living in reverent obedience before those rules. Living in reverent. That scroll is to remain at his side at all times. He is to study it every day so that he may learn what it means to fear his God, living in reverent obedience before these rules and regulations by following them. He must not become proud and arrogant, changing the commands at whim to suit himself or making up his own versions. If he reads and learns, he will have a long reign as king in Israel, he and his sons. The Levitical priests, that's the entire tribe of Levi, don't get any land inheritance with the rest of Israel. They get the fire gift offerings of God. They will live on that inheritance. But they don't get land inheritance like the rest of their kinsmen. God is their inheritance. This is what the priests get from the people. This is what the priests get from the people from any offering of an ox or a sheep: the shoulder, the two cheeks, and the stomach. You must also give them the first fruits of your grain, wine, and oil, and the first fleece of your sheep, because God your God has chosen only them and their children out of all your tribes to be present and serve always in the name of God your God. If a Levite moves from any town in Israel, and he is quite If a Levite moves from any town in Israel, and he is quite free to move wherever he desires, and comes to the place God designates for worship, he may serve there in the name of God along with all his brother Levites who are present and serving in the presence of God. And he will get an equal share to eat, even though he has money from the sale of his parents' possessions. When you enter the land that God, your God, is giving you, don't take on the abominable. When you enter the land that God, your God, is giving you, don't take on the abominable. No, that's not right. When you enter the land that God, your God, is giving you, don't take on the abominable ways of life of the nations there. Don't you dare sacrifice your son or daughter in the fire. Don't practice divination, sorcery, fortune telling, witchery, casting spells, holding seances, or channeling with the dead. People who do these things are an abomination to God. It's because of just such abominable practices that God it's because of just such abominable practices that God, your God, is driving these nations out before you. Be completely loyal to God your God. These nations that you're about to run out of the sun, be completely loyal to God your God. These nations that you're about to run out of the country consort with sorcerers and witches, but not you. God your God forbids it. God your God is going to raise up a prophet for you. God will raise him up from among your kinsmen, a prophet like me. Listen obediently to him. This is what you asked God your God for at Horeb on the day you were all gathered at the mountain and said, "We can't hear any more from God, our God. We can't stand being any more. We can't stand seeing any more fire. We'll die." And God said to me, "They're right. They've spoken the truth. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from their kinsmen. I'll tell him what to say, and he will pass on to them everything I command him. And anyone who won't listen to my words spoken by him, I will personally hold responsible. But any prophet who fakes it, who claims to speak in my name, something I haven't commanded him to say, or speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet must die." You may be wondering among yourselves, how can we tell the difference whether it was God who spoke or not? Here's how. If what the, if what the prophet spoke in God's name doesn't happen, then obviously God wasn't behind it. The prophet made it up. Forget about him. When God, your God, throws the nations out of the country that God, your God, is giving you, and you settle down in their cities and houses, you are to set aside 3 easily accessible cities in the land that God, your God, is giving you as your very own. Divide your land into thirds. This land that God, your God, is giving you to possess, and build roads to the towns so that anyone who accidentally kills another can flee there. This is the guideline for the murderer who flees there to take refuge. He has to have killed his neighbor without premeditation and with no history of bad blood between them. For instance, a man goes with his neighbor into the woods to cut a tree. He swings the axe, the head slips off the handle, and hits his neighbor, killing him. He may then flee to one of these cities and save his life. If the city is too far away, the avenger of blood, racing in hot-blooded pursuit, might catch him, since it's such a long distance, and kill him even though he didn't deserve it. It wasn't his fault. There was no history of hatred between them. Therefore, I command you, set aside the 3 cities for yourselves. When God, your God, enlarges your land, extending its borders as he solemnly promised your ancestors by giving you the whole land he promised them, because you are diligently living the way I'm commanding you today, namely to love God, your God, and do what he tells you all your life. And when that happens, then add 3 more to these 3 cities, so that there is no chance of innocent blood being spilt in your land. God, your God, is giving you this land as an inheritance. You don't want to pollute it with innocent blood and bring guilt upon yourselves. On the other hand, if a man with a history of hatred towards his neighbor waits in ambush, then jumps him, mauls, and kills him, and then runs to one of these cities, that's a different story. The elders of his own city are to send for him and have him brought back. They are to hand him over to the avenger of blood for execution. Don't feel sorry for him. Clean out the pollution of wrongful murder from Israel so that you'll be able to live well and breathe clean air.